Hello, and welcome to the All Things HCDE podcast, a student-led project brought to you by the Human-Centered Design and Engineering Department at the University of Washington. Here, we discuss the core concepts and leading industry trends in human-centered design and engineering. Curious about the method? Current student or industry professionals seeking for more content on HCDE? We've got you. This is your host, Jillian Zhao. I'm currently a second-year master's student in the Human-Centered Design and Engineering Department at the University of Washington. Prior to that, I also went to University of Washington for my bachelor's degree, where I majored in psychology and minored in informatics for my undergrad. Hi, here is co-host Yani Liu from the Master of Science in Human-Centered Design and Engineering program at the UW, with a past background in architecture and landscape design.
Hello, I'm Hamdia Jamal, and I'll also be your co-host for today. A little bit about me, I just completed the User-Centered Design Certificate program within the Human-Centered Design and Engineering Department this past spring. And I also just completed my first quarter as a HCDE master's student.
And we're excited to dive in. Hamdia, Yani, what is our episode covering today?
We've put together an awesome first episode covering the essentials.
Not only what human-centered design is, but also why human-centered design is needed today. Let's get to it. Today, we invited guests Brandy Arnold, Laura East, and Esther Lin, who graduated from Human-Centered Design and Engineering program at the University of Washington. Let's see their insights on human-centered design. I'm sitting here with Brandy. Brandy, can you introduce yourself?
My name is Brandy Arnold. I live in Seattle, and I'm a UX researcher currently at Meta Reality Labs. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's in human-centered design and engineering. I've been doing UX research since 2009 across a few different companies, including Microsoft, Bungie, HBO, and currently Meta.
Thank you for that introduction. We also have Laura here. Laura, could you also tell us about yourself?
Yeah, hi, my name is Laura East Ochoa. I use she, her pronouns, and I work at the University of Washington Department of Epidemiology as their Director of Communications.
Thank you, Laura. Lastly, we have Esther with us here today as well.
Hi, my name is Esther. I am currently a first-year master's student studying interaction design at the School of Visual Arts. I'm currently working as a design intern at Xbox for the summer, and I graduated from UW HCD back in 2020. And for the past 3 years, I have interned and worked as a product designer for 3 different startups, from industries like industrial IoT, healthcare to startup incubators. And I work across multiple platforms and have led multiple designer products at both school and work.
Thank you all so much for being here with us today. Let's dive right in with our first question. What caught your eye about design? And maybe more specifically, what caught your eye about human-centered design? Let's begin with Esther. Any thoughts?
That's a great question. I think you gotta take back to the fall quarter of 2017, where I took the HCD 210, taught by Andy Davison. It was my first introduction into the design space. And I remember one thing that was still very memorable to me was he showed the video of the ideal redesign of the shopping cart, and that video was showing how people work together in a space and how do they actually go to grocery store and talk to people about their experience with the shopping cart, and taking that insight into the redesign was really inspiring to me, see how designers actually work with people. And that was my first start in this long journey.
Wow, that is fascinating and inspiring. Thank you for sharing that with us. That takes us to our next question. What is human-centered design? Let's hear from Brandy first.
Ooh, all right. So I would say that there are two key components that just come to mind right off the top of my head. First, you're designing things for humans based on human characteristics like physiology and behavior and psychology. And the second part is that you're involving humans throughout the design process as part of your exploration and ideation and evaluation. And all of this is rooted in what in the industry we often refer to as people problems, designing things that solve real problems and provide real value to humans. So a solutions first approach is more like you have an idea for a product that you want to build, or an app or a game or whatever product or service, and you start building it because you want to, not necessarily because you know who you're building it for or why you're building it or how it might add value for people. You're just making it and hoping it will resonate. That's not really human-centered design.
Let's popcorn to Laura.
I think that human-centered design for me is really designing with people and communities in mind and their needs. I think it involves inquiry, ideation, iteration, and implementation are things that come to mind when I think of human-centered design.
And what about you, Esther?
And I know a lot of people have different answer, depends on their experience with the field and also their expertise. But from my experience it's just a process of solving problem by putting people at the center of the product development process. My understanding is nothing is perfect, including human, and human do make mistake. Therefore, when we design things, even we intend to design things in a way, but since people are different and the habits they have is different, the way we use the product can go wrong in any way. So as a designer, we need to anticipate what could go wrong and how to design a way to help people recover from the error and interaction.
Thank you all for sharing your definitions of what human-centered design is. This brings us to our third questions. Esther, if you're working on a team, how do you know if human-centered design is being used?
The short answer is when the question is when the product is accessible and used by human, then we know like the human-centered design process is being employed. At school, we learn like there's this like whole research process, there's design process. But I feel like back in school, we were taught design process in a way that is linear. Is like you have deliverable after research, you have deliverable after design and ideation, but in reality, it's not really like that. It's an iterative process that goes hand in hand. And like even though you're finished design, you could also go back to research to see how your things is being used by people. So it's a really like iterative process other than linear.
Thank you so much. That really provides clear insights on how we can know if a team is using human-centered design. All right, let's talk about the next topic. Brandy, Esther, what are the challenges of human-centered design? Like, what do you see as kind of the obstacles for designers when they're implementing this philosophy in their design strategies?
I think the first one that immediately comes to mind that so many of us struggle with, whether you're at the smallest startup all the way to like the biggest company with the deepest pockets, is always just either not having enough time or resources to really do it right. Because there's a lot that you can do and you can't possibly do it all. There's always too many research questions to answer, so many design iterations that you could potentially come up with, and you really kind of have to know how to prioritize and know when to quit, So I think just being able to focus and prioritize, understand that you're never going to be able to do it all. That's sort of almost, I would probably even argue that that's like a universal challenge for doing human-centered design, is you can never do 100%. The other thing, at least particularly with the industry, is balancing user needs with business needs. When you're lucky, both of those things are the same thing. A lot of times there's a little bit of discrepancy between the two, but you still have to find the right balance, because users, like, let's just use games, for example. I've worked in games a bit. Users would love to say, give me the game for free. And as much as we would love to give them the game for free, we have to pay the people who build the game and keep the lights on in the studio and things like that. So to some degree, you have to make a compromise there. So yeah, balancing user needs and business needs, certainly another one. And sometimes also another one would be getting buy-in or alignment from your stakeholders, just the cross-functional team that you work with, because you might not all agree that something is a problem or a priority, and people have to be kind of persuaded or, just make trade-offs.
And all we can do is to have our best guess based on what we got, and always have the ambitions of doing more to learn about people. Because the world is not ideal, or at least the industry is not ideal compared to the school. In school, we can just kind of do whatever we want, be really kind of creative about our solutions, but in real world there are so many elements goes into what launched a product, from dev, from PMs, from designer, from research, from business. There are so many other things you need to balance. So the challenge is to balancing all those things, and that's the reality of the world.
Wow, I agree. Being able to balance the user and business needs can be challenging. That was very insightful. Thank you both. I'm interested in the distinction between human-centered and user-centered. Is human-centered design just another name for user-centered design? I would love to hear all of your thoughts on this question. Let's start with Brandy, then Laura, and then Esther.
So yes and no, and it depends on who you ask. I like to think of those two as being sort of a Venn diagram with a lot of overlap. So to me, human-centered design is more about designing things that are inherent to human behavior and cognition. Most of us have eyes that see better in the light than in the dark. We have hands with thumbs that we can use for grasping. We have two legs that we can walk around on, and we can use words to communicate. And so there are exceptions to those, of course, those with accessibility needs and things like that. But generally, that's sort of one way of thinking, is you can build these things based on just inherent human characteristics. User-centered design, the way I've heard it typically described, is a little bit more of a narrow take on this. So it goes deeper on a specific target audience. Just to give a random example, if you're designing a chair for humans, it's probably going to be roughly about the same height. At least if you're designing it for adults, we're all kind of similar in size. It's probably not going to be 12 feet tall. Let's see, it's we tend to sit on our butts and not on our elbows. So it's going to be designed for that sort of physiology. You know what I mean? That's going to be a factor. And then a lot of the characteristics that make a chair comfortable are going to be fairly universal. You want to sit on something soft, not on something spiky. That's kind of human-centered design. But if you design a stool for the patrons of a bar, or a recliner for somebody to lounge in at home, or a electric mechanical chair that helps somebody with mobility impairment, sit down and stand up more easily. That's more like user-centered design. But I think there's a lot of overlap there. Some people use those terms interchangeably. Some people might define them differently. That's probably my best attempt at describing it.
I think there is a way that using the term user creates some distance from the person that we're talking about. They're just a person who uses your product or your website or your app. Whereas if we think about someone as a human and we think about them as a person and they're like a whole person that is not only engaging with your product or service, but they also have a lot of other needs and a lot of other draws on their attention. And we can pull from psychology and other fields about the ways we move around the world.
It really depends on the context. So many people use it interchangeably. But I think the word human is richer. Because when we think of user, it's just thinking about their interaction with the product. But when we design, it's important to consider things outside, like what makes human a human. So the kind of environment they live in, the social status, the financial situation, daily habit. So I do think that the word human makes design richer, and it could potentially influence whatever design we come up with.
That's very insightful and helpful for our listeners to understand the nuance of the different names. Thank you. For the next question that we have, I think I'd like to ask specifically for Laura and Esther. What do you think the future of human-centered design might be?
So I guess my hope for the future of human-centered design is really putting marginalized communities and people who have historically been excluded from design thinking and design thinking conversations, and really thinking about how to honor and pay people for sharing their lived experiences to help inform design, because it's going to be better for it.
So it reminds me of one of my kind of teachers that was taught us the conversation design in grad school. She's from Google and she designed conversation in Google Home. And she was saying that right now we all call interaction designer, or we all call UX designer or product designer. But in the future, in 3 to 5 years, all designers will be called interaction designer. Because it's not just about products or user anymore, it's about human. And as designer, the interaction is a more broader kind of category to embrace all of those different kind of design. And right now, when people think of design, it's only in your product space, but I do think it could extend to so many other areas, such as physics or even landscape architecture or even aviation, because we live in the world that we design for humans. So it could go so broad, and I can just see the possibility is endless.
That's really fascinating to think about. I'm very curious to see what the future of human-centered design will look like. Coming up after the break, we're going to step away from our guests for just a moment to establish some context and historical understanding of human-centered design and engineering. We will be right back. We're back. So why is human-centered design valuable? How did human-centered design emerge? Modern design methodologies rarely have a single path or lineage of design approaches, and the same is true for human-centered design. Despite inclusion and understanding of the user being a theme in philosophy and academia, formal design methodologies didn't always include thought for those who are using the design. Human-centered design has deep roots in the Scandinavian approach to participatory design, which emerged from a need in the 1960s to democratize the design of systems. The workers at factories wanted to participate in the design of the systems they ultimately used. In the 1970s, Dor Norman advocated for user-centered design. Service design, considering how the designed product developed relationships with the community, also informed what today professionals and students alike term as human-centered design.
Let's get back into it with our guests. Design history points to HCD emerging from multiple locations for several reasons. What history about HCD sticks with you and drives you to use HCD?
My answer to this question is either going to be very disappointing or very satisfying. We will find out which one, I guess. So, full transparency, none of it. In my day-to-day, I do not think about the history of human-centered design at all. So that doesn't really drive me. However, I do like to think a lot about the future of human-centered design rather than the past. And like, how do we excel at design collaboration in a distributed workforce where people are remote and in different time zones? Like, that's one that, we've leaned into a lot in the pandemic, but there's still a lot of challenges there that we haven't figured out yet. So yeah, it's all those hypotheses, all those unanswered questions about the future. That's what drives me.
I have to say, Brandy, I do like the idea of thinking of the future and how it drives others as well. It's really interesting to think about. And that brings us to our next question.
Don Norman, in Design of Everyday Things, says HCD is a philosophy that can be added to other design areas of focus like interaction design, experience design, and industrial design. How does HCD modify these focus areas? And why is this important? Let's start with Laura and then Esther.
So I think that HCDE modifies those fields when you're employing those principles of, let's say the objective is to design a museum exhibit. And so there are people whose job it's my understanding, to, put up all of the art on the walls and, make the lighting, the best for the art. But how can you think about, like, what are those questions about, who are the people that we want to be engaging with this exhibit? Where are they? How are they getting their information? What are maybe some barriers to going to an art museum that we can think ahead about, that we can be creative about helping to address? How can we involve those people in those conversations? How can we set up maybe a little pop-up exhibit to kind of test out some of our ideas based on what we heard? And then how can we implement our exhibit with their initial goals in mind, but also thinking about these people that we want to engage, and then figure out how to test, like, did we get it right? Like, what was their experience and how can we make that better at the next time we do this exhibit? And so I think that asking those questions throughout the process and keeping those people in mind first and foremost is really going to elevate any of those areas of the design industry.
Whether I've learned so many design methodologies like community-centered design or laboratory-centered design. Like, there's so many names that we call those, like, different methods, but essentially they're just a way of approach problems and put emphasis on different areas. So I don't know if you want, like, specific example of the implementation, but one thing that was, like, really fascinating to me is the conversation design, because there's no screen. It could be sometimes have screen with, like, Google Home, but when you just think about human conversation with a technology, that is human, like, that you're gonna take into all those, like, where human is, where the environment is when people have those conversations, like what their intention is. Even though there's no screen, there is still interaction happening. Why is it important? Going back to what I said earlier, is we want to design a product that is usable and accessible for people to use.
Thank you for both of your responses. It was very insightful. That actually ties into our next question.
Are there benefits of HCD regarding processes and teamwork? Which is to say, if you're on a team of people who are employing HCD processes, are there benefits or challenges or both for the team? Let's start with Brandy this time.
Yeah, I would say a huge benefit is that a team can align on like the goal of a product or a system that they're designing by like really defining and understanding the user problem that they're trying to solve. Everything that they do should then point back to that problem.
Laura, what do you think?
So I think I've heard this saying. It's like, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. I don't know who to attribute it to, but I think there are ways where it can be really beneficial to bring different ideas and skill sets to the table that help the end result be better than it could be if just one person did it. And there can be more complexities that are just sort of the inefficiencies that come with working with a group of people and people having different opinions, having different working styles. And so I think, that is inherently a challenge, but I think it is usually a good one. It's like we all need to learn how to work in a team, even if we're people who are better individual contributors.
How about you, Esther?
In real world, design is just part of it. It's just part of the product. So you have PMs, you have dev, you have researcher. I've seen PMs using Figma and create PM design. People will laugh about it, but I really value how other people with different backgrounds can contribute their ideas, because there's not just designer have ideas. Everyone has idea. And my manager is always saying, like, go talk to different stakeholders, whether they're marketing, their business, or PM. They always have a point of view of looking at problems. So definitely the benefits of bringing design to more people is to get a diverse of perspectives, because that will just help you build a better product. But the limitation is sometimes people don't really understand. So I definitely see more benefits than the challenges of implementing either in workplace or school.
Wow, you all bring a very valid point about teamwork and getting insight from various people involved in the project. Thank you for sharing that. And that brings us to our next question. What are some skills or knowledge that you learned through HCDE that you have found invaluable in the workplace? This time we can start with Brandy, followed by Laura, and finally Esther.
Ooh, in addition to learning the really practical stuff like, research methods and things like that, I think there's one quote that one of my professors once said, are you asking the most interesting question? It's really not just about asking the obvious questions, but are you asking the most interesting question? And I still kind of come back to that, gosh, it's been 15 years or something now?
Process of inquiry has been really helpful to me in that even if I'm not working directly in research, it's helpful to, instead of making assumptions, to ask some of those questions that we've been exposed to in the program. So like, that's really interesting. Like, tell me more about that. Or using silence as a tool to get people to sort of elaborate more on what they're saying. And I think there's ways that that's useful in any work environment. And what I mean by that is like, maybe someone is in a really specialized industry and they're talking about an artifact. So like some kind of like object, and you might not even know what the object is called, but you can still ask questions about it. You can still like gain a lot of knowledge really quickly about a field that you know very little about.
Another pieces I found the most valuable is the storytelling. I know a lot of people say that, but that's very true, because design is not just what you do in Figma, but it's also how you explain this Figma to other people. and everyone loves story. And whenever we have chances to present, really think about who your audience is and the way of you presenting. Again, implementing the HCD process in presentation and your portfolio is definitely will help like the student or even incoming like student who want to join the workforce. That's really important. Use what you learn in everything you do. Yeah, and storytelling is one part of it. The second is connection. HCD is a really tight community that everyone is here to help. Yeah, so those were my top two, storytelling and the community. It's something I learned a lot from HCD department.
I agree. Those are all invaluable pieces of information that we can all use in our work. That actually ties us into our next question.
Esther, exploring ethics in UX and design generally, what responsibility does a designer have, if any, to the user's well-being?
The most direct answer is do not harm. I know that's really broad. I admit that. But we use so many products from the morning that we wake up till the night, like till we go to bed. Like we interact with so many things in the world to help us live our life. So the responsibility of the designer is to make those hesitation, make those confusion, make those crying less. Um, like as designer, we use so many products and we got frustrated. Someone designed it, like it's their job to make this better. So we're here to help. And like that sense of achievement and responsibility, it's a mix because when you care a lot, you feel like stressed out a lot too. It's like when you try to design for one group of people, maybe there are someone getting left out because you can't design for everyone. That's what we say a lot in the department. Like if you design for everyone, then you design for no one. But how do we start from one group, really design for them, and then start expanding it to make it more inclusive and accessible to others? It's something I wish I learned more in the department. Because we learn how to design for one group. But in the corporate world or in the industry, sometimes your product is only used by one group of user, but a lot of the time, other people will use it and you want to make sure they have a good experience too. So how do you accommodate their needs and use, even though they're not your primary users?
You brought up really good points and questions. That is something for all of us to think about. Thank you for sharing that. I believe that brings us to our last and final question.
So, Esther, why should companies hire the students from the HCDE program?
You can teach a designer to have pretty visual in a short time, but you can't teach a designer to think in a really short time. Design is a marinated process. Like you can teach how people like, a lot of pretty visuals on Dribble or even Behance. Like those are great, but like those are not really usable until they solve a problem. So what's great about people with human-centered kind of design thinking and with that background is we think, we learn how to think. And usually people struggle to compare our background with people with really strong visual. It's like our portfolio is not as pretty. Like we show a lot of the research process, but but people don't hire us. I would say visual is definitely a big part of it because we like to see things. But as a person from HCD, I realized that the advantage of coming from that program is I think of problems a lot more in depth. And that's kind of the advantage of us compared to other students in other backgrounds. And the visual skill, it's something I need to work on or all the HCD students need to work on, but that could be self-taught. But how you think, it's from all of those projects you have done, all the internships, and also all the classes that talk about ethics, talk about sustainability, talk about design thinking, talk about history of design. Those are things that all come together to make us a strong candidate.
I definitely agree that HCDE gets to the root of design and prepares students for the industry. Okay, Laura, why don't you recap and tell me why is human-centered design important?
Yeah, I think human-centered design is important because, we interact with products and services and technologies, thousands of times a day, every day. And I think there's an opportunity for us as human-centered design practitioners to think about that, about people's experience and making that better. And, where we can, making people's lives easier and ideally having fun and being inspired throughout the process. That's why it's important to me.
Thank you for sharing that, Laura. I think we all learned so much valuable information here today. And again, thank you, Brandy, Laura, and Esther for sharing with us.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. Feedback is the most valuable asset here on All Things HCDE. Please fill out the Google form linked in the description box below and send us topics you'd be interested in learning about in the human-centered design world. Thank you.